You're watching an episode of Blacklist Builds. In this episode, I'm replacing my stock shifter with ECS Tuning's short throw shifter. I just want to give a huge shout out to my friends at ECS Tuning for hooking me up with their short throw shifter. So shout out to ECS Tuning. I'll leave a link of this product in the description down below, so go check it out. So this car has 85,000 miles on it, and the bushings in this shifter are worn. So there's a lot of play, a lot of slop, and it's time for her to get an upgrade. So I thought it would be appropriate to replace it with ECS Tuning's nice shifter. My friend Eli at Ignition Tube highly recommends this short throw shifter, so I will also be making a review video sharing my personal opinion on this as well, so stay tuned for that video. So the first thing you have to do is pull back on this HVAC system. So you want to make sure not to scratch the faceplate, but what you have to do is disconnect these controls right here. So the way this connector mechanism works is that after you pull back on this red tab, you press down on this black one to release the clip, and you have to pull it out backwards. After you unplug these connectors, take a small screwdriver and pry out this wire harness holder. Next, you can take the HVAC control system and place it somewhere safe. So an effective method of removing this leather boot is to pull back a little bit to the side, wedge in your trim removal tool, and lift up and just pry it out of its holder. You can flip it all the way up. Now we have to disassemble the MMI controls. In order to remove this center console trim, you have to pull upwards on both sides and pull it apart. So next, remove the wiring harness underneath the e-brake and the MMI control. So one word of advice while you're doing this, just keep in mind that there are parts that can potentially scratch your center console trim if you're not careful. So just keep that in mind as you're trying to remove the wiring harness. So press down on the top of this connector to release it from the e-brake button. So the last clip holding onto the MMI control is this brown wiring harness. So press down on this clip and pull downward to release it from the MMI controls. Now take a 8mm ratchet and remove these two bolts holding the ashtray. So right here where my index finger is, and over here. So once removing the two bolts holding the ashtray and pulling it out, there is this wiring harness. If you wanted to, you can just leave it hanging. I personally like to disconnect things just in case. I don't want to put any tension on the wires, but what you can do is you can unplug it right here to remove the ashtray completely and give yourself a little bit more free space. You want to lift the leather shift boot up, lift up this noise insulator up as well. You want to go around and lift up, or sort of flip up, pry up the rubber boot underneath. So I'm just running my hand around, rolling the edge of it so it comes off its base. So now it is off. Next step is to get underneath the car, disconnect the shifter from the linkage underneath. So underneath the car, what we have to do next is remove these 6 nuts holding the heat shield in place. 6 nuts. And this one, that one, and this one. So go ahead and take a 10mm ratchet and remove those 6 nuts. So if you slide the heat shield back, it should give you about, it looks like 3 inches, 4 inches of more space, exposing the shifter linkage, which I'll be showing you next. Once you remove the heat shield, next step you want to do is take a piece of tape, wrap it around the shifter linkage, and take a permanent marker and draw a line. That way, when you're reinstalling the shifter, you can align the shifter linkage to the shifter and everything will work correctly. So this is the piece that connects the shifter to the gear selector rod. That being said, this was a pain in the ass to take out. So in order to take this out, you first must take a 10mm wrench, place it on this side, take a small 10mm ratchet and loosen up this nut, pull out this bolt, and the selector rod will drop down. Afterwards, take a 45mm Torx socket, loosen up this Torx screw. So this opens up and slide it off the gear selector rod. Now we're back in the car. Lift up this rubber boot all the way up. So in order to take this out, what you have to do is you have to take a screwdriver and pry apart the two latches on both sides of the gear selector. Take a little screwdriver, pry it on both sides, unclip, and lift it up. With the shifter outside of the car, now what we can do is take the components from the stock shifter and switch it over to the ECS short shifter. So in the first step, you want to take a flathead screwdriver and pry this clamp loose. That way this shift knob can be removed from the stock shifter. You can adjust the leather boot and just slide it right through so that comes off like that. And now what you want to do is take a flathead screwdriver, place it into this clamp, and loosen it up enough for this shift knob to come off the stock shifter. So with the clamp loose, you can just take it off the shaft of the stock shifter. So now you can take the rubber boot off the stock shifter. So what we have to do now is take out this retaining clip for the spring. So take your screwdriver, place it in here, take off the top hook right here, and hold the spring in place so it doesn't shoot out. Retaining clip, and the spring and everything else will come out like this. So next step, take your ECS short throw shifter, take a 3mm Allen key, and remove this bolt. Remove the top portion of the gear stick. If it doesn't move, loosen the Allen screw where my thumb is with a 2.5mm Allen key. Remove this screw entirely, place it somewhere safe, and take these two perches off the shifter. Now you should have something like this. Now take your ECS tuning plate and remove one of these Allen screws. Slide the retaining plate onto your shifter. Next, take your lower perch and slide it onto the gear selector, like so. Next, take your spring from the stock shifter and place it onto the lower perch with this nylon bushing. Then take the top perch and place it on top of the spring, like so. Compress the spring and make sure that the hole for the Allen screw that we took out before lines up with this gap in the perch. Most likely what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with the height once I put it into the car, but I do want to have additional height. I'd rather have a taller gear stick where it's closer to the steering wheel than a shorter one. I'm going to make sure that the screw lines up with this groove right here, and I'm going to tighten it so it doesn't move. So now this is the assembled gear stick, and we're going to place it back into the car. So take a colored Sharpie, metallic Sharpie, or a paint marker and mark off the center line where you made previously. I did not make a perfect center line, unfortunately, so what I did was I did a little bit of an offset to the right. Hopefully this will line back up onto the gear selector rod. So take your bearing cup, make sure the lip is towards the bottom of the car, and slide it into the shifter mount. Take your shifter, make sure the tab is on the right side facing towards the passenger side, and slide it into the bearing cup. Take a 4mm Allen key and tighten down these retaining tabs to the shifter base. When you take a look at this adjustment block, there's a flush side and there's a side with a gap. When you install this back onto your selector rod, you have to tighten down the flush side first and then clamp down the shorter side after. Additionally, make sure to install the bolt from the short side of the adjustment block. Make sure the nut is on the flush side. You can see the space, the sort of groove there is for the nut to tighten down. So make sure the nut is on this side. Lastly, the placement of the bolts is important. As you can see, there are 4 holes. That being said, the highest point is the longest throw, and the one farthest at the bottom is the shortest throw. So I'm going to go ahead and place my bolt when I reinstall it into the vehicle to be at the shortest throw, or the bottommost placement. ECS also provides you with a bag of Threadlocker as well, but I just personally like Loctite's 243. Apply some Loctite to your bolts, that way they hold in place, it doesn't back itself out, and it's easier to remove later on. You don't have to tighten the bolts back in completely, just leave them loose enough for you to tighten down once you get it onto the gear selector rod. Again, when you're installing this, make sure that you choose the proper height adjustment hole, but keep in mind that all 4 holes have to line up with the shifter. So the only thing that changes the height is the placement of the bolt. And if you feel like your gears are not going in place, you're going to have to rotate that adjustment block accordingly. So that line that you made before, it's a rough guesstimate as to where you need to align everything. To change the height of the shifter, you loosen up the Allen screw right here with a 2.5mm Allen key, and you can adjust the height. ECS recommends that you turn it in these 7 revolutions, so that way it's seated into the shifter. So I'd rather have my hand travel a short distance. So that looks about good. Go ahead, take a 2.5mm Allen key and tighten up this Allen screw. To tighten down the shifter, I have a pass-through ratchet, but you can use a 19mm wrench and just hand tighten it. If you are interested in any of the tools that I use during this episode, I'll leave a link in the description down below. So when you're reinstalling this rubber shift boot, keep in mind it makes it a little bit easier if you shift it into 3rd position, the rubber boot over the lip of the plastic trim at the base of this shifter, and then work your way to each corner and just make sure that it wraps around completely. That way when you lift up on this rubber boot, it doesn't come off. Everything is back in place. Really happy with the hand placement of the shifter. It's a lot closer than the stock one, and everything is working great. Reverse, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. In the future, I'm going to swap out this leather shift boot and swap out this worn shift knob as well. I appreciate you guys watching. I'm going to make a review video regarding this shifter after I've spent some time with it, and I will report back how I feel about the shifter. Again, huge shout out to my friends at ECS for sending this shifter over. Super happy with the quality of the build. Install, overall, I would say it wasn't too difficult, but it was a pain, especially because of my MagnaFlow resonated X pipe with the 2 dampeners underneath the transmission, taking up more of the space. But if you have stock down pipes, I don't see much of an issue of reaching your hand in there. But overall, in terms of adjusting this, making sure everything works, it's really not that scary, and it's super simple. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please hit subscribe down below, and I will see you guys on the next episode.